Boker Tov, today's daf is daf Tes. And let's keep in mind the sheet of Rava, which is on daf Ches Amud Beis. And Rava is of the opinion that we apply a principle called Palginon Dibura. And the Gemara establishes in the name of Ada that Rava is standing on the shoulders of Reb Shimon, who holds in the Mishnah in Peah, in the third parak, Palginon Dibura, in the case of HaKosev, a man writes a shtar, Kol Nechasav La'avodav, and he gives away all his nechasim. And the question is, since he was Mishayar Karka, then we don't know whether or not he's giving away his Eved, and he's being Mishachar his Eved. But Rabbi Shimon, here on the top of Daf Tes Amud Aleph, says that Li'olam Hu Ben Chorin, that as far as the Eved is concerned, he's Yotze L'Cheres. And it matters not whether or not the Adon was Mishayar from his Nechasim Liatzmo Karka Kol Shehi, and it doesn't matter whether he's Mefarish exactly which Karka he left for himself. And Rabbi Shimon applies the principle of Palginon Dibura. And that means that we know that he wasn't Mishayar for himself and in one scenario, or in another scenario where he was Mishayar Karka for himself, but he didn't explicate which Karka he left for himself. So we're not going to say that he meant to be Mishayar the Eved and he wants to leave his Eved for himself. But rather, we're going to interpret his words to mean that he's being Mishayar only Karka, but not his Eved. Ad sheyomer, until the Adon says explicitly, Kol nechasai nesunim leploni avdi, chutz mi echad mi ribun shebahem, which means 1 out of 10,000 of his nechasim, 1 over 10,000. In other words, he wants something that's not worth anything. In that case, perhaps he has kavanah for his Eved, and therefore the Eved is not Yotzi L'Cheres. But from the fact that Rabbi Shimon says Li Olam, the first word on our Amud, he's always a Ben Chorin, we're going to derive the conclusion that his kavanah, Rabbi Shimon, was to teach us that in every case the Eved is Yotzi L'Cheres, unless he says Chutz me echad mi ribu shalahem. So even in a case where the Eved is not zoch at all in any karkos, for example, when the Adon says chutz mi karka kol shehi, and he doesn't explicate and specify which karka he has in mind, then the Eved is not zoch in any karka. Because any particular karka that you want to isolate, we have to be choshesh that perhaps the Adon wanted to leave that karka. That's the exact one specific karka that he wanted to leave for himself. But nevertheless, even though the Eved will not be zoch in any karka whatsoever, he was zochel v'atzmo, and he goes l'cheres. And even though the Adon wrote in the shtar that all his nechasim are knuyim la'eved, and from the language of the shtar, the dibra shtar, it includes all the karkos, including the Eved, and nevertheless, the Eved is not going to get the karka. But we're going to say Palginon Dibura, and we're going to say that as far as the Eved himself is concerned, according to Rabbi Shimon, the shichur is chal through this statement. And now the Gemara wants to assume that Rava, who holds that if a person wrote in a shtar, kol nechasai, which means he was kolel, he included the Eved in all his nechasim, then we're going to split his dibur into half, Palginon Dibura. And it's going to be meaningful as far as the Eved, but only as far as the Eved and not as far as the nechasim, because Rav accepted Rav Shimon's principle of Palginon Dibura. So the Gemara now finishes up, so to speak, the statement of Rav Adabar Ava, and how does Rav Paskin like Rav Shimon, V'omer Rav Yosef Barman Yomi Omer Rav Nachman, and we have to emphasize here Rav Nachman, Afal Pisha Kiles Rav Yossi as Rabbi Shimon, even though Rabbi Yossi was very extols the greatness of Rabbi Shimon, but nevertheless, Ein Halacha Kemosa, Halacha Rabbi Meir. The Halacha is like Rabbi Meir, who's the Tanakama of the Mishnah in Peah, because Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir holds that the Eved does not go out lecheres because we don't apply the principle of Palgina Dibura. So how could Rav Paskin like Rav Shimon, who holds Palgina Dibura, when Rav Nachman says that we don't accept Rav Shimon in this machlokus, but rather we accept Rabbi Meir, and the Eved does not go lecheres? This Sanya, the Gemara now brings a brisa where we find that Rabbi Yossi was mishabeach the words of Rabbi Shimon. Kishenemru advarim, when the words of Rabbi Shimon were presented lifnei Rabbi Yossi, Karol Avasam Bikrazeh, he quoted the pasuk in Mishlei Chaf Daled, Sfasai v'Yishak, Meshiv dvarim nechochin, that if somebody says words of truth that are straight, we should really hug him and kiss him. So the Gemara now wants to prove that Rav Nachman did not accept Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara says the following: Umi Omer Rav Nachman Hachi, is it really so? You're quoting Rav Nachman as saying that we don't paskin like Rav Shimon and we don't accept the principle of Palgina Dibura. Based on that, you asked the Kash on Rava. Omer Rav Yosef Bar Yomi, Omer Rav Nachman, Shchiv Meira, a person who is on his deathbed, Shekosav Kol Nechosav Li'avdo, and he wrote away all his possessions to his Eved, and then miraculously, V'omad, he became healthy, Choser B'nechosim, he's allowed to retract all the matonos that he gave, because they were all given on the condition that he would, on the assumption he would die. But v'yeinu chos b'Eved, but the Eved is zocher b'atzman. So the shichra Eved is something that he can't be choser bo. Now, again, as we'll see in the development of the sugi, it's not that the Eved is already ben chorin, but it means einu yochel lachzor bo, that the Eved has a partial kinyan in himself to block the chazara of the Adon, who was a Shchib. And Rav Nachman explains this. Choser b'nechosim, why is it that all the matonis that he wrote are batal mevutal? Because matnas Shchib, because the matonis were given al das, that he would die. And since he's now healthy, he can retract all these gifts. But Ein Choser b'Eved, Sharei Yotza Olav Shem ben Chorin. So when he's Meshachar the Eved, he cannot be Choser bo, because the Eved has already entered into the state of Kedushas Yisrael. His entire essence has been transformed from that of an Eved to that of a Ben Chorin. And therefore the Adon can no longer be Meshabe this Eved. Now again, at this point, if the Adon wants to be Choser bo, he cannot be Choser bo, because the Chachamim evaluated the kavana, the intention of the Shchimira, that the Eved immediately should become a Shuchra without adding any conditions as to whether or not the Shchimira would die or not die. So even though the Shchimira wrote Kol Nechosai, we're going to implement Palgina Dibura, and we're going to say that the word Kol will only be fulfilled, would only be valid with regard to the Eved. But as far as Kol Nechasai is concerned, that's not a valid matana, because if he stands up and he lives, then he could be chosba, could retract it. But anyway, we see clearly Rav Nachman holds that we accept the principle of Palgina Dibura. And yet earlier we said that Rav Nachman accepts the Shita Rabbi Meir, and we don't say Palgina Dibura. So we have here an inner contradiction as far as the Shita of Rav Nachman is concerned. So now the Gemara is going to quote Rav Ashi, who assumes that Rav Nachman paskins against Rabbi Shimon, and yet, even though he paskins against Rav Shimon, it's not because he rejects the principle of Palgina Dibura. There was another reason why Rav Nachman paskins against Rav Shimon. Elam Rav Ashi, really, in truth, Rav Nachman holds that we accept the principle of Palgina Dibura. And why did he paskin like Rabbi Meir? That's not because we reject Palgina Dibura, but rather Chosam, in the case of Kosev Nechosav Liavdo, Hainu Taima, Mishum delav krus gitahu. We're going to have a whole sugya coming up, Mitzvah Shem, about the comparison between the get of shichur and the get of an isha. Just like in the get of an isha, you need an absolute krisus without any holds bar. It's got to be crystal clear that the get is going to sever the relationship between the Baal and his wife. So too, in the case of a get shichur, we have a halacha of krus gita. We need an absolute clarity that in the lashon of the shtar, that his kavanah is to completely sever his ownership over the eved. Because when the adon adds or incorporates the eved in one word together with shar hanechasim, then you know what? There's a chashash, there's a slight suspicion that maybe when he was Mishar Nechasim, he was also Mishar the Eved. So therefore, the krisis of the get is not clear, it's not certain, and a shtar cannot be kores. In the case of a get shichur, like the case of a get isha, and that's Rabbi Meir's point, if it's not absolutely clear, and therefore the Eved doesn't go lecheres. So that's the shita of Rav Nachman accepting Rabbi Meir. But he didn't accept Rabbi Meir because we reject the principle of Palgina Dibura. So now we no longer have a contradiction in Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman on the one hand can paskin like Rabbi Meir, and the Eved does not go lecheres, and at the same time he can paskin with regard to Shchimera, Palgina Dibura, and the Eved goes out lecheres. Because the reasoning that underlies Rabbi Meir that the Eved does not go lecheres has nothing to do with rejecting Palgina Dibura, but because the Shtar Shichur is not a kores. And the same thing is true if he wrote to his Eved, Kol Nechasai Knuyim Lecha, which we had Rabbi Rava Shita on Daf Chesamid Beis, that Atzmo Kana, but Nechasav Lo Kana. In other words, he goes Lecherus, because that's considered a shtar that's kores kedin. It's an absolute kores. The lashon of the shtar is clear that he wants to be Meshacher his Eved. Otherwise, why did he write Kol Nechasai Knuyim Lecha? I mean, how could the Eved be Kona the Nechasim unless he's Meshuchra? And in that case, even Rab Meir would agree that the Eved is Yotze Lecheres because it's a get HaKores, a Shtar HaKores Kedin. As far as Zechiyah ben Nechasim, his dibur is not meaningful and valid because we need kiyum kichol shtari mamon. As far as the mamonous aspect is concerned, we need what's called kiyum. So we're going to apply the principle palgina dibura. The shtar is going to be effective as far as shikra eved is concerned, but not as far as zechiyah ben nechasim. Okay. Now we go back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if he brings a get from one place in Eretz Yisrael to another, he does not have to say b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. Yeshal of Orim. However, if there are ma'arim who say that the get is possible, for example, they claim that the get was mezuyaf or the get was written shalol l'shma, is then yiskayim b'chosmav. And once you mekayim the get b'chosmav and we verify the signatures, then the get is chal, and it repels any suffix on the kashrus haget, even with regard to lishma. So Gemara says, irur kama. How many witnesses do we have in order to set up an irur on the kashrus haget? Ilema irur chad. If we're going to say that one witness is sufficient to create an irur, that means everybody agrees that an irur is not valid to generate a suffix on the kashrus haget unless there are two eidim to be ma'arer. V'ela irur detrei. So you're going to now assume that there are two eidim of being ma'arer, and they're saying, well, this get is mezuyaf, this get was not written lishma. Is trei u'treinu. What are you going to gain by being Makayim the Chasimas of the Eidim when you have an irur of Shnayim? So you have two Eidim being Makayim the Chasimos. You have two Eidim who are claiming that this shtar is a forgery. So my chaz is the Samchas Ahani Smoch Ahani. Why do you accept the Eidei Kiyum who established the veracity of the chasim on the get, why don't you accept the two Eidim who are ma'arer? And therefore, we're left with a suffix as to whether the get is kosher. So how could the woman get married based on this suffix get? So we've rejected both the possibility of ir chad and the possibility of ir b'shnayim. Ella, says the Gemara, ir de Baal. The Baal is the Baalite star, the Baalite get. And if he claims that this get is mezuyaf, or that it wasn't written lishma, then he has the power to create a suffix on the get, but only b'toras one aid. And therefore, if two aidim now will testify and verify the chasimos, the signatures on the get, then we don't accept the ira Baal. And now we get to the Mishnah here on Daf Tes. Amevi get b'medinas hayam. He brings a get, a shliach from Chutz La'aretz, Teretz Yisrael. V'eino yochol lomer v'fanei nechta. He cannot fulfill the takonis chachamim of b'fanei nechta. Im yesh olav edim. If there are edim who could be mekayim the chasimos, he's kayim b'chosma. And now we don't need the testimony of the shliach. We're going to have a whole sugya now comparing and contrasting Gittin Noshim and Shechrei Avodim. Shavu, they're equal as far as Lishma is concerned. Lemolech, which means if he's taking the get or the Shtar Shikr from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, Ulemevi, or the opposite direction, then we need the testimony of B'fanei Nechtam. And that even applies to a get Shichrur, because a get Shichrur has to be written Lishma. Zu achas min hadrachim sheshavu Gittin Noshim l'shichr avodim. This is one of either 3 or 4 comparisons between equal comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechrei Avodim. Both require lishma, and hence the shliach from Chutz La'aretz, etc., has to testify b'fanei nechta. The Gemara says, "My eni yachal loma." What exactly does it mean that for some reason or another the shliach cannot recite b'fanei nechta? If we're going to assume that he's a cherish, in other words, he's mute, he's deaf and mute, then he can't be a shliach. Cherish bar asuya gitahu? Rhetorical question. But now we have a Mishnah later on, a daf chav gimel, a kol ksherim lavis aget chutz mi cherishot v'katan. We need a bardas to serve as a shliach, and a cherish is a la bardas. Ella, the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef Achamayas and Kigon Shenisanolah, he gave the get over to the Isha before he became a cherish, kshupikeh. However, in that interim, before he got a chance to recite b'fanei nechtam lo hispik, ad shenischarish, he became a cherish, and now he's a la bardas. He's not capable of testimony b'fanei nechtam. The Mishnah says, according to the Tanakam of this brisa, we have a 3-way commonality between Shavu Gittin Noshim Shechrei Avodim. Number 1, Shavu L'Molchel Mevi, which means, and in both cases, we have to accept and receive the testimony of the Shliach Fanei Nechta to clarify that the get or the Shtar Shikr was written Lishma. Number 2, v'chol get sheyesh alav eid kusi pasul. In regard to all shtaros, we don't rely on a shtar that has the signature of an eid kusi. Chutz mi Gittin Noshim v'shechrei avodim. If one of the signatures on the get or the shikhr was a kusi, then it's kosher. And the Gemara Daf Yud is going to explain that kusim are gerei emes, but nevertheless they are chashudim on edus sheker, but we'll accept them mishum aguna in the case of get isha, and for similar reasoning in the case of shikra avodim. Number 3, v'chol ashtaros,